Well, we live in days of terrible, I was about to say we live in days of great polarization, but it's not great polarization, is it? It's terrible polarization, where people take sides, where people are thinking one thing and other people are thinking another, and never shall they meet. We live in days of terrible polarization. And you would think that we as Christians, we would be the ones to speak into this world that is so polarized and say, here's what it looks like to be one body. We are the body of Christ. There is only one body, one church of Christ. And one body, here's how we walk together. Here's how we face life together. Here's how we face struggles together. And yet we in the church sometimes, and I'm not talking we at Calvary Baptist Church, I'm talking we as the church around the world, sometimes we are the ones to lead the way in being polarized. And that instead of sitting together, instead of standing together, instead of taking our seat beside each other, we take sides instead. Instead of sitting together, we stand against each other. We've seen an example of this in the book of Job. And Job here, he is one who his friends come to comfort him, as Maureen read, all those big names from lands that have even bigger names. And his four friends come to comfort him, but he is not comforted by them. Actually, it has been said, I forget who said it first, but Job's friends did a wonderful job of showing empathy and compassion to Job until they opened their mouths. And then once they started to speak, it was all downhill from there. They started out well, spending a week with him in silence, because what he was going through was so difficult and so hard. Yet once they started talking, they failed at showing empathy and compassion. And it could be that in such a tough world we're facing today, that maybe we as Christians are failing in walking together with empathy and compassion. And like Job's friends who instead of sitting with him stood against him, maybe sometimes we fail to sit with one another, Christians that is, and we stand against one another. Maybe we are failing in walking together. We want to be a kind of people. We're out on this sermon series, What Kind of Church? We want to be a kind of people who are walking with empathy and compassion, and walking with others in empathy and compassion. But there are 3 roadblocks on the way to empathy and compassion that we learn about in this book of Job. And so we're going to take a look at those 3 roadblocks, and I invite us this morning to maybe consider if these are 3 roadblocks that we're facing in the church today worldwide, the church today in North America, but also how about with our own selves? Maybe we face these 3 roadblocks too. So what is the first roadblock to showing empathy and compassion? Well, the first roadblock is certitude. That Job's friends, when they gathered together, they were so certain of what they knew to be true, so that when Job spoke, well, they had to speak against what Job spoke, because they knew he was wrong and they were right. They were certain of what they knew to be true. And when you read through the book of Job, and maybe we'll set this as our homework for tonight, is to read through the entire book of Job, and you'll discover that it's between chapters 3 and 37, they're just arguing back and forth between Job and the 3 friends initially, but finally the 4th friend, he pitches in too. And it's just argument against each other. And for us reading today, it can actually be a bit of a tedious read, reading through Job, especially chapters 3 through 37, because it's just arguing with each other. Why were they arguing with each other? It's because each were so certain that they were correct. Now, in the end, God speaks and says, "You friends have not spoken truthfully about me as Job has." So in the end, Job is the one who is declared to be righteous and speaking the right thing. But these friends who came to console and comfort Job, who came to sit with him, they could not do that. They instead stood against him because they were so sure that they were right and that he was wrong. We see a similar kind of certitude in Saul of Tarsus. Saul of Tarsus, he is of course the one who became Paul, the Apostle Paul. But he was so certain that he was correct in persecuting the early Jesus followers. And let me read this quote from Brian Zand, or Zond, I don't know how you say his name. Never mind the biblical names, I don't even know how to say today's names. But here's a quote from his book called When Everything is on Fire. Saul was furiously enraged because he was certain that he was right and the Christians were wrong. Biblical certainty was the drug of choice for this young Pharisee, but it only made him mean. Certitude can be an incubator for cruelty. Perceived infallibility can lead to brutality. I'm going to read that again because it's more profound than anything I'm going to say this morning. Saul was furiously enraged because he was certain that he was right and the Christians were wrong. Biblical certainty was the drug of choice for this young Pharisee, but it only made him mean. Certitude can be an incubator for cruelty. Perceived infallibility can lead to brutality. Zahn then goes on to describe how Paul, in meeting Jesus, not only did he come to faith in Jesus, not only did he come to experience salvation in Jesus, but he also had a big shift from his certitude being the top thing that marked out his faith to love being the top thing that marked out his faith. You've heard the expression, they'll know we are Christians by our answers to every question, right? They will know we are Christians by the fact that we know everything. They will know we are Christians by our certitude and our certainty. Of course, we all know that's not the expression. They will know we are Christians by our love. Are we able to make that same step that Paul made in moving from certitude as being perhaps the thing we find to be so important to love being the thing that is so important? So that's the first thing. The first roadblock on the way to a world in which there's empathy and compassion is certitude. Certitude sometimes strips us of our empathy and compassion. Here's the second thing, and it's closely related, and that is that being right, winning the argument, becomes the main thing. The friends had gathered to console and comfort Job, but it just turns into argument. They forget that they're there to console him and comfort him, to be empathetic towards him, to show him compassion. They forget all that. And it becomes just about winning the argument. It's a case of one-upmanship as each tries to better Job's arguments. There is within this discussion between Job and his friends a lack of discussion. It's not a discussion, it's not a conversation, it's a series of lectures, one against the other. It's not conversation. And at no point do we see them saying, well, wait a minute, let's sit together and think through things and reason through things and set our hearts upon things and let's work this out, let's figure out what's true. We never see that happening with Job and his friends. What we see happening is each one of them saying, I know the way, listen to me. They're each trying to win the argument. It's not a conversation, it's an argument. Can we move from arguments to conversations? Or is winning the argument the main thing for us? Or is actually entering into a world that has empathy and compassion, is that the main thing for us? Are we about winning the arguments, or are we going to be about conversations that we can pull through together? Instead of standing against one another, pull through together to finding truth and the way forward. So that's the second thing that stands in the way of, it's a roadblock to empathy and compassion in a world full of empathy and compassion, is when people need to win the argument. Here's the third one, and it is that self-centeredness gets in the way. And here we'll turn to Elihu. I think that's how you say his name, Elihu. And we can read about, now he's the youngest of all the friends. And so he keeps quiet. He defers to the older ones, just like I kind of should do too. I should be one of the last to speak maybe, but no, joking. But he defers to wisdom, the older ones who are wise. But then once they've spoken, at the end, he takes his turn. So let's take a look at some of the things he says. He says this, I also will give my answer. I also will declare my opinion, for I am full of words. The spirit within me constrains me. My heart is indeed like wine that has no vent. Like wineskins, it is ready to burst. I must speak so that I may find relief. I must open my lips and answer. I will not show partiality to any person or use flattery toward anyone, for I do not know how to flatter, or my Maker would soon put an end to me. But now hear my speech, O Job, and listen to my words. See, I open my mouth. The tongue in my mouth speaks. My words declare the uprightness of my heart, and what my lips know, they speak sincerely. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Answer me if you can. Set your words in order before me. Take your stand. See, before God I am as you are. I too was formed from a piece of clay. No fear of me need terrify you. My pressure will not be heavy on you. But then he goes on to say this a little later on. Bear with me a little and I will show you, for I have yet something to say on God's behalf. This is Elihu, the youngest, speaking here, and yet he's speaking on God's behalf. I will bring my knowledge from far away and ascribe righteousness to my Maker, for truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you. What does Elihu do when he starts to speak? Not only does he jump into the argument, but he starts talking about himself a lot. Listen to me, and here's the reason why you should listen to me. He jumps in and truly inserts himself in, and it becomes all about him. And sometimes that can happen in conversations when we get with people and we forget to be empathetic, we forget to be compassionate, because automatically something relates to us. And then it becomes about us. And maybe we change the conversation to being about us. And so we forget to be empathetic and compassionate to somebody who really needs us, perhaps in the moment of, like Job, to focus on them. Do we do that? Where we don't just jump into the conversation, but we put ourselves into it. We put ourselves as the focus of it. Maybe sometimes we do that. But certainly in this world where there's polarization, and in the church worldwide where there's polarization, we stick ourselves in there, don't we? And what we know, and who we are, and how God has blessed us. And so we want to be careful of that. Can we make the same move towards humility that Job does by the end of the book of Job? He is humble by the end of the book. But maybe we want to make the same move as Jesus Christ. Paul writes these words, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in your humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Jesus Christ, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself, became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Can we make that same move towards humility? Empathy and compassion sometimes requires us to pick up our cross and follow in the way of Jesus. making it not about us, but making about the person or the people who need our empathy and our compassion. That's what Jesus did. Did not regard equality with God as something, this is God the Son we're talking about, did not regard that equality with the Father as something to be exploited, but instead emptied himself. Why? Because we needed his compassion. In our sinfulness, we needed him to do what was necessary to reconcile us to God. A great expression of the love of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the great expression of God's love for us. And it was expressed through humility. Are there people in our life that need empathy and compassion? Can we be humble when we're with them? We are, of course, continuing on in this series, and Sam is going to put the slide up now, this series on what kind of church I've ended up calling it. We're halfway through the series before I end up giving it a name. And looking at the cultural statements of Open Table Communities. That's our interim pastor while I was away in sabbatical. He is the executive director of Open Table Communities. And as I've said before, when I saw those cultural statements, I was like, those are good. And those would make a good sermon series to think about those. And so the one today, and really I thought these are things that the kind of church that Jesus would feel comfortable. The kind of church that Jesus would say, yeah, they get me. They understand. And so today's is a culture that celebrates empathy and compassion. And so we nurture relationships and gatherings where being with people in the midst of their journey is more important than being right or being in control. We encourage empathetic listening and compassion for each person's unique journey and story, including our own. Are we willing to be that kind of people in this kind of world, empathetic and compassionate people in the polarized world? It will make a big difference.